The case of State versus Scott Peterson, to me, feels like it just happened yesterday.
The FBI is now joining the search for a missing California woman who is 8 months pregnant.
Today, how will you remembering your wife and your son?
That's very personal. I continue to look for, obviously, times when it's difficult to go on, obviously. So thanks very much.
There's pictures of you and the girl together. So we know that's true, right? What can you tell me about my sister to make me understand that you're telling the truth?
At the end of our last episode, Sharon Rocha remained angry and shaken after her final face-to-face encounter with Scott Peterson. She parted ways with he and his sister-in-law Janie after a bizarre dinner that had left her with the sense that something was about to break, and she'd been right. By the 15th of January, her pregnant daughter Laci had been missing for 21 days, and the due date for her grandson Connor was now less than a month away. Sharon had been broken from the moment she learned Laci was missing, and by this point, her grief and exhaustion had her mind and body worn thin. And later that evening, a crushing meeting with detectives threatened to push Sharon over the edge. She and Ron were called to the police station around 5 p.m. and already expecting significant news, or at least ready to hear something that couldn't be handled over the phone, which was unusual. Sharon braced herself as they sat down with Modesto PD detectives John Buehler and Al Brocchini. But nothing could have prepared her for the things she would learn that night. They hadn't been there long when Buehler slid a photo across the table, and Sharon's heart sank. She recognized Scott in an instant, but she'd never seen the blonde woman wrapped in his arms before. She gazed at the picture for a long while as the detective spoke, before finally asking, why did he have to kill her? She repeated the question over and over, not really expecting answers, and never taking her eyes off the photo. But Buehler and Brocchini did try to give Sharon some answers that night, although they'd also given her reason to suspect Laci met a savage end, which only compounded her grief. They told Ron and Sharon that Scott purchased a $250,000 life insurance policy before Laci disappeared, and that they'd found blood in the house. The blood evidence all but confirmed for her that Laci was dead, and it caused her to repeatedly imagine the violence her daughter'd gone through before being killed. But all of the blood identified in the case was determined to be Scott's, though we're not sure when investigators were made aware that it wasn't Laci's. As for the life insurance policy, it was active and valued at $250,000, but it was purchased when they bought their house 2 years prior, and Scott hadn't worked out the details alone. In fact, Laci not only sat in on the meeting with the insurance broker, but insisted her policy be increased from $100,000 to the current $250,000, in order to be equal with Scott's. But Sharon left the station that day unaware of either of those things, though ultimately, they were inconsequential. Because the detectives also told her about Janet Isle, the woman Scott cheated on Laci with when they were just newlyweds in San Luis Obispo. For Sharon, the lies and the cheating coupled with his bizarre behavior after Laci's disappearance were enough. She'd been hanging on to Scott's innocence by a thread for some time, and though the court detectives working the case and the press she'd encountered daily tried to urge her along the path to acknowledging his guilt, it was the affair that had tipped the scales, and his lies about it made her doubt every other aspect of who she thought he was. She thought back to the week before, shocked at the dinner table while he told them about a photo with him and some girl, implying that police did a good job faking the picture, and she realized it must have been the same photo detectives just shared with her. And she recalled Ron's last encounter with him too, knowing that he'd given him an opening to be honest, encouraging him to deal with an affair head-on from the start if that was the dirty truth of it, but Scott denied it flatly, defending his fishing trip to Berkeley in the same breath. He'd categorically denied cheating during his interviews with detectives as well. Beginning with his first round of questioning with Brocchini on Christmas Eve, up until the point when he was faced with black and white evidence of the affair. The photograph shared with Sharon and Ron on the 15th was also shared with Scott the week before, though because police didn't have their hands on the original yet, he was shown a fax copy. Something about the grainy no-color photo must have made him think he'd be able to deny it was him, because that's just what he did, scrambling late to dinner with Sharon and several others directly after he'd been confronted with it at the police station, to plant the seeds of doubt about the affair with his peculiar story about the picture. His ability to look them in the face and lie so ruthlessly was all the further evidence Sharon needed from Scott to know her daughter was gone forever. Walking out of the police station, she replayed the last 3 weeks in her mind and realized she'd been dead wrong about what he was capable of, and broke down when they reached the parking lot. Ron carried her to the car to rush her home, and during our next episode we'll talk about a heartbreaking vision Sharon experienced that night, and the dark defense her mind created as the horrific reality of Laci's fate sunk in. But for now, let's take a look at Scott's lover and determine exactly what he'd been capable of over the past several weeks. Amber Dawn Frey was born in Los Angeles in 1975, and her February 10th birth date was the same day baby Connor was due. She was a massage therapist when she met Scott just 34 days before his wife disappeared, but she'd previously worked as a teacher just like Laci. Both women were beautiful, intelligent, and knew the value of hard work. Sadly, they also shared a family history of divorce at a very young age, and both had some experience with toxic boyfriends in high school as well. Amber was a single mom living in Fresno when her best friend set her up with Scott. She was 28 years old, caring for her 21-month-old daughter on her own, and she'd been alone for some time. She'd had a bad streak of luck in her romantic life during the years leading up to their introduction, and though it'd be hard to top the hell she went through after meeting Scott Peterson, he wasn't her first heartbreak, nor was he the first married man she'd been involved with. So, let's go back to Amber's beginnings, to better understand how their relationship played out in the end. As we said, Amber was born in LA and her sister Ava was born 3 years before her. Their parents, Ron and Brenda Frey, moved the girls to Fresno when they were very young, but sadly divorced when Amber was 4, and their relationship after wasn't too friendly, causing her to scarcely see her father. Though she said her parents tried to make co-parenting work, she took on many of her mother's emotions towards her dad after the divorce, telling him she hated him after moving into a small apartment with her mom and sister. Her mother worked as a nurse full-time and kept a second job as a waitress, leaving Amber and Ava to frequently fend for themselves. And though she was only 5 or 6 at the time, she said she hadn't needed much parenting, pointing out that she was a good kid and her mother's absence wasn't an issue. When her mother wasn't working, she was out on the town looking for a new man, and eventually she found one. He quickly moved her and her young girls out of their small apartment and into a nice home. She liked Brenda's new boyfriend and enjoyed the few years she'd spent there, expressing fond memories of the camping trips they took as a family, and the beginnings of her regular church attendance, though the church wasn't something her mom ever warmed up to. Amber and her sister were collected on a bus every week to attend Sunday service, and she recalled just one instance when Brenda joined them. Her mother'd worn casual clothes and thought the other women in the pews disapproved, so, immediately feeling judged, she never went back. Though her mom didn't share her connection to the church, Amber did reconcile with her dad around this time and they'd begun to mend their relationship. But not long after that, Brenda and the man in the nice house abruptly split, and the girls wound up back in an apartment in Fresno. Though her mom found herself single again, working harder than ever to make ends meet, she hadn't given up on her search for Mr. Right, and when she was introduced to Ava's best friend's father, she thought she'd found him for sure, and they quickly got married. Ava and her best friend turned stepsister were in the same class in school and already spent a lot of time together, but the marriage made them even closer, and they often excluded younger sister Amber from their plans. But they weren't there long enough for it to grow into much of a problem, because Brenda divorced him not long after they'd married and the girls were back on their own, though it wouldn't be for too long. Amber was 8 when she and Ava said goodbye to their stepfamily, and she was 9 when her mother met Mike. But Mike was different, and finally, after 5 years spent searching for a good match after her split from Amber's dad Ron, she found the man she'd spend the rest of her life with. Brenda moved in with Mike, but promptly sent her daughters away to live with their father shortly after. It seems there was also a large gap of time before Brenda saw the girls again, though Ron was glad to have his daughters with him. He told Amber that he'd always wanted to have more time with them, but their mother never made it easy after the divorce. Her dad's place was just north of Fresno, in the western foothills of Yosemite National Park, and though he lived alone when Amber and Ava arrived, he was dating a woman who he soon married and moved into the house as well. But Amber said the woman was odd, and they didn't see much of their new stepmother. She kept to herself more often than not, either in her bedroom or at the stables on the property, until the marriage fell apart not long after, leaving the girls alone with their father again. Ron was self-employed as a contractor and he worked a lot, but he would often take Amber with him on jobs, putting her to work laying bricks or building fences on the weekends. He would also take the girls to church every week, which she and her sister found less thrilling than they had when they were younger and often complained about. But when the new pastor started a youth group program they were both excited about, she and Ava became happy to attend regularly. Their little family was running smoothly for a while when Brenda began to visit the girls again, but not long after their reunion, she suddenly cut off all contact with her father. Ava continued to live with Ron, but Amber abruptly wasn't allowed to see him anymore, though she never did learn why. Her mom would intercept the letters Ron wrote to his daughter, but eventually one of them got through, and she was excited to read that he was coming to see her soon. But when the day came for his visit, her mom intervened, pulling her out of school early and keeping her away from the house to prevent him from seeing her. She was very unhappy living with Mike and Brenda, though she says her withdrawn attitude and lack of interest was mostly to blame, but she also said there wasn't much interest from them either, and her grades suffered with no one to urge her to study or discipline her for low marks. Amber never received any more notes from her dad at home, but he didn't give up, sending his next letter to her school where she finally got it. In it, he told her he loved her and that he desperately wanted to see her, but shortly afterward he and Brenda were in court fighting for custody. A mediator was brought in and Amber was given a choice of which parent she wanted to live with. But she found the decision too overwhelming to make at just 12 years old, and ultimately refused to choose between her parents, leaving it for the court to determine. They sent her back home with Brenda. As a freshman in high school, she entered into her first serious relationship with a senior several years older than her, and was 15 when he convinced her to give up her virginity. They stayed together until her junior year, but he was jealous and controlling, causing constant arguments. The relationship also caused conflict at home with her mother, and after things came to a head with Brenda, she moved back in with her dad. Amber broke up with the controlling guy when she moved, but soon after enrolling in her new high school, she met a boy with a mole on his nose named Moises, and fell for him quickly. He was vegan with long hair and dressed a bit like a hippie, and Amber soon changed her style to match and cut most of the meat out of her diet as well. Moises also began attending church with her and they grew very close, continuing their relationship after her graduation from Clovis High School in 1993, which she completed with an impressive 4.0 grade point average. She and Moises both attended Fresno City College, where Amber earned 2 degrees, one in general studies and the other in child development. But she also got pregnant during her college years, and was nowhere near ready for the responsibility. She doesn't specify whether Moises was the father or not, but the choices she made surrounding the pregnancy were a great source of shame for her in the years after her 1997 graduation. She turned to God for comfort, and after joining a local church she was hired to teach Sunday school, later working full-time in the aftercare program at the attached parochial school. Amber was doing well for herself, landing a rewarding job working with children which she loved, and earning enough for her to keep her own place and buy herself a new truck. But then she started dating a married man with a pregnant wife. But it wasn't Scott, and even though Amber called him Steve in her book, that's not his name either. His real name is Josh Hart, and Josh was a professional dancer. They'd met at the gym and were initially just friends, but the more she heard from Josh about his troubled relationship with his expectant spouse Michelle, the more she found herself comforting him, and after a chance encounter led to the pair going dancing at a club, they became more than friends. Josh told her he was a good Christian man, and although he and Michelle no longer had a relationship, he planned to be a proper father to the baby. Josh and Michelle tied the knot in a rather untraditional fashion, and he told Amber the marriage was over nearly as quickly as it had began. They'd taken a trip to Vegas and agreed they'd made a huge drunken mistake by getting married, and by the time they got back to Fresno they knew it wouldn't last. But she was already pregnant. And though Josh made it seem their split was mutual, it seems Michelle wasn't on the same page. It wasn't long before he was proclaiming his love for Amber, but Michelle made it very apparent that she wanted to claw her eyes out, blaming her for their broken marriage, though the relationship was over long before they'd met, at least according to Josh. Amber said Michelle had problems accepting responsibility for her part in their split, laying the guilt on her rather than looking to herself, and noting that Josh was with another woman before her as well. But again, this conflicts with his story about a mutual split after the Vegas wedding, so who knows? A few weeks later, a very much still married Josh moved in with her, and the tension only grew as the due date approached, with Amber sensing more and more that his feelings for her were beginning to dull. She assumed he might be doubting his decision to give up his family, and gave him an opening to go back to his wife, and though she says he didn't take it, other sources say that he eventually did. Not long after, she threw her boyfriend a baby shower, but ironically, he didn't get to stay for the whole thing because his wife went into labor. Amber was a bit hurt when he left her to be with Michelle for the birth, but she went to visit the baby in the hospital soon after as well. She and Josh stayed together for a few months after his little boy was born, and he worked hard at being a father, but her relationship with him fell apart soon after when she alleged that he put hands on her, filing charges 4 days after the incident. Josh claimed the charges were in retaliation for leaving her and going back to his wife, but Michelle met with Amber soon after to tell her she didn't want Josh back, and hearing about the charges Amber filed against him, tried to get her help gaining sole custody of their son. Amber refused to get involved in their court battle over the baby, and cut ties with Josh and Michelle Hart soon after that, never hearing more about the woman or the child, but she did learn that Josh finally got a divorce a year later, and promptly made his way back to Vegas to marry someone else. By the time they split, Josh had ruined her credit, and completely wiped out after her tumultuous relationship with he and his wife. Amber found she didn't have the energy to do her job well, and quit. She moved into an apartment in the art district of downtown Fresno for a fresh start, working a few different jobs and attempting to go back to school, but she was burned out on love and spent most of her time alone, focused on building her relationship with God. But then she met Anthony Flores. Anthony struck up a conversation with her at a restaurant in the neighborhood and invited her to a party, and though she said he was nice enough, he was a total stranger, so she didn't go. But she ran into him again a month later and he asked her out, so she took a chance. Anthony was creative and ambitious, and reminded her very much of Moises. The two of them got serious very quickly, and it wasn't long before she'd quit school and her job, to help him run his window washing business. But she wasn't ready for the commitment of a live-in boyfriend, so when he wanted to move in with her, she told him no. In 1999, not long into their relationship, Amber responded to an ad in the paper for a model and wound up taking several topless photos. Anthony wasn't pleased when he learned about it, but she'd had reservations about taking the pictures to begin with, so she decided to shy away from that type of modeling for good. Just a few months after the photo shoot, she became pregnant with her daughter Ayana, and a month or two after that, Anthony left her. He tried to convince her to consider their options with the pregnancy, telling her he wasn't ready to be a dad. He even tried to set up a counseling session for the two of them to learn about the adoption process, but she wouldn't consider going. Ultimately, he was unable to commit to being a father, and she was both unable to repeat the regretful decisions of her past and unwilling to place their baby for adoption, so Anthony broke things off. She said he left her pregnant, broke, jobless and alone, and that he'd found a new girlfriend almost immediately. But she didn't resent him for moving on so quickly, saying that he simply must not have been in love with her, that if he were, he would have been happy to become a father. With Anthony out of the picture before the end of her first trimester, she'd had a difficult time of things, especially in the early half of her pregnancy. She was working long hours waitressing, not making much money, constantly on her feet, and knew she'd be fired as soon as the baby started to show. Struggling, Amber had another chat with God, committing her life to Him fully, and things took a positive turn for her immediately. She was thrilled to find a desk job, relieved to be off of her feet for the last half of her pregnancy, no longer concerned about being fired over her growing belly, and because it was only part-time, she was able to start teaching again as well, something she was very excited about. Soon after, she found a guest house for rent that was more affordable than her apartment and began to make it her own. Though it was cozy at just 800 square feet, it was the perfect size for her and her baby girl Ayana, who was born on the 20th of February 2001. Amber was able to save enough money during her pregnancy to live frugally while she took 6 months off of work to be with her new baby. And in September of that year, when Ayana was 7 months old, Anthony was also ordered to pay $567 a month in child support. Adjusted for inflation, that amounts to around $970 each month, which certainly must have helped them get by, but it was later determined through a DNA test that Ayana wasn't his. He paid support of over $900 a month for 5 years, before learning the father of Amber's baby was actually a local restaurant owner named Christopher Funch. Anthony later said in an interview that he was hurt when the paternity testing revealed the truth, telling the Modesto Bee, quote, "I feel foolish and I feel betrayed. I otherwise feel I was being cheated on. She was very convincing when she told me I was the only person who could be the father." End quote. After Ayana's birth, Amber decided to head back to school instead of going back to work, with plans to become a massage therapist. With some help from the government with child care and part of her tuition, and large student loan she had to pay back later, Amber completed her certification in less than 6 months, graduating on March 5, 2002. She was hired full-time by chiropractor Dr. David Markovich directly after her graduation, and she worked out of his office until November, when she decided to make the move to American Body Works. Dr. Markovich tried to convince her to stay at his practice, but Amber wanted to branch out under her own name with her own clients. Being a friend, Dr. Dave wished her luck and future success, although it certainly wouldn't be the end of their relationship. We'll discuss more about her involvement with Dr. Dave Markovich closer to the trial portion of the series, but for now, let's find out how she got tangled up with Scott Peterson. Amber and Scott connected through her best friend, Shawn Sibley. Shawn worked for an agricultural research company and was introduced to Scott by a mutual friend and colleague at a trade convention in Anaheim on the 24th of October. The two apparently hit it off and spent most of the night flirting, heavily. They watched football as a large group and then went to dinner with a couple of other people afterward, where Scott asked Shawn what he should write on his badge to attract women. After they sat down at the table, she playfully wrote "I'm rich" on his name tag, finding it fitting after hearing him boast about owning 2 homes and being so wealthy and successful. But Scott didn't care for it and said he was leaning more towards writing "horny bastard" instead. Even though Shawn had a fiancée named Tommy, she engaged with Scott in some very risque conversation over dinner, including a detailed discussion about their preferred positions in bed. Things got so uncomfortable, Eric Olson and Dave Fernandez left the table, leaving Shawn and Scott to spend the rest of the evening together. We'll recall that Eric Olson was Scott's employee at the time. They both sold Trade Corp products and worked under the company name, but Scott actually hired Eric and paid his salary. Well, at least he did, until Eric resigned 2 days after Laci disappeared, citing issues with his benefits package and Scott's work performance. Eric comes back up in our next episode, along with another colleague named Mike Almasri, who also interviewed with Scott for the job the previous summer, but obviously didn't get it, when he went with Eric instead. But before we talk more about Mike and Eric, there's plenty more to discuss about Shawn and Scott on the first night they met in Anaheim. First of all, interestingly enough, the convention where they met was actually held at the Disneyland Hotel, not far from the theme park Scott and Laci visited with his family just a few weeks later. So after Shawn and Scott thoroughly got to know each other over dinner, grossing out Eric Olson and Dave Fernandez, they headed to the hotel bar on their own for drinks. During part of their conversation, Scott told her he was tired of having one-night stands and wanted to find a woman who wasn't just a bimbo, someone he could build a future with. Shawn immediately thought of her best friend Amber and gave Scott her phone number. After drinking together for a while, the two of them headed upstairs where they stayed up all night, though Shawn says all they did was talk. She was in a shared room at the hotel, and since it was occupied, they sat together in the hallway until around 3:30 the next morning. And while we'll never know everything they discussed that night, we do know they talked about business at some point, and Shawn was left with the impression Trade Corp may have some work for the agricultural research firm where she worked. They exchanged contact information and parted ways after breakfast the following morning, and Sean emailed him just a few days later, excited about the prospect of getting a new client, and referring to him as HB for horny bastard. But she must have been excited at the prospect of a new beau for her best friend as well, emailing a few more times over the next week, not only asking about the work he might have for her firm, but wondering when he was going to call Amber, finally asking if he was chickening out. And of course Sean already told Amber to expect the call from the hunky guy she met on business in Anaheim, telling her that he was such a good catch she would have taken him for herself, had she not been so in love with her fiancé Tommy. A couple weeks later, Scott finally called her for a date. They made plans to meet in Fresno on the 20th of November, which also happened to be his parents' 31st wedding anniversary. Laci was around 6 months pregnant when Scott went on his first date with Amber Frey, and she'd spent that evening at Renee Tomlinson's house watching The Bachelor with a group of friends. It was the second season finale, and they gathered to see whether Aaron Burge would choose between a beautiful brunette named Helene, who was a 27-year-old child psychologist from New Jersey, and a lovely blonde named Brooke, a 22-year-old senior at the University of Alabama. Around the time Aaron gave his rose to Helene and she accepted his marriage proposal, Scott arrived at the Elephant Bar in Fresno to meet Amber. Dressed in a suit with a grin on his face, he found her waiting for him in the lobby, but they'd only used the Elephant Bar as a place to meet before going somewhere else for dinner. So they made their way outside, and after exchanging their initial greetings, Scott told her he was nervous meeting her. He also told her he'd spent the day working, not having a chance to check into his hotel or change out of his suit, so they headed to the Fresno Radisson. Scott showered and changed his clothes. But before leaving for dinner, they shared a bottle of champagne Scott seemed to have at the ready. He pulled it out of his luggage, along with a box of strawberries, and placed a berry in each glass before pouring their drinks. Amber later recalled that the strawberry she'd eaten from the container was sour. After finishing their drinks, they left for a Japanese restaurant called Edoya. They initially sat in the teppanyaki area of the restaurant, which is the open grill style seating that's shared with other diners. You can watch the chef grill the food, and it's sort of half dinner and half show, but it's not very intimate, which wasn't the vibe Scott was shooting for that night. So after Amber sat down at the grill, he left the table and came back with the hostess, who showed them to a separate room with a sliding door for more privacy. The room was sunken, and they had to remove their shoes and go down a few steps to get to the low table, where they sat on the floor to eat their dinner. Amber was already becoming impressed with Scott, and they had a pretty romantic dinner together, as he told her lies about nearly everything about himself, other than what he did for a living, because Sean obviously knew the truth about that. Over dinner and several drinks, he told her he owned a home in Sacramento as well as a condo in San Diego, but he said he traveled so much for work that he rarely used either, mainly living out of a suitcase in his truck. In fact, he said he was thinking of selling the San Diego condo fully furnished along with the Land Rover in the garage, because he used them so rarely. He also told Amber he was thinking about selling a boat he never got time to use as well. And then he told her about his holiday plans with his family for Thanksgiving and Christmas. He said he was taking a fishing trip to Alaska with his dad and his brother on Turkey Day, and going to Kennebunkport, Maine over Christmas with his parents. Laci was 28 weeks pregnant, but of course there was no mention of her or baby Connor. Nearly everything he told Amber about his life that night was a lie, though he did tell her he leased a warehouse in Modesto. He later used the address through the pack mail post office box for Trade Corp as a cover so he could safely receive mail from her, keeping her from realizing he actually lived in Modesto with his pregnant wife, rather than alone in a large 1940s single-family home in Sacramento. To be fair, he was also honest with Amber about his mother's chronic bronchitis and his love for good wine, but he told her so many lies from the moment they met, it's a wonder how he kept them all straight. He even told her he would love to have pets but chose not to, since he was away from home so often it wouldn't be fair to the animal. Poor Mackenzie. The two of them became so wrapped up in the fanciful conversation, they didn't realize the restaurant was closing and the hostess had to politely ask them to leave, suggesting they head to the bar next door if they weren't ready to call it a night. They weren't, so they headed to BB's karaoke lounge for more drinks and a tipsy slow dance to Frank Sinatra. They sang Islands in the Stream on the karaoke stage, and when they sat back down after their duet, Scott asked if she was a smoker. She said no, and he leaned in for their first kiss. After closing the bar around 3 the next morning, Amber was easily too drunk to drive home, but rather than get a taxi, she rode back to the Radisson with Scott. And although he must have been too drunk to drive as well, they stopped at an all-night liquor store on the way to get a bottle of gin. They made their way up to Scott's room where more kissing went on, which quickly led to bed activities, and they fell asleep together after. The two were woken up a few hours later to Sean Sibley, trying to reach Amber on her cell phone. She'd come to Amber's house to babysit for Ayanna during her date with Scott, but she was not expecting her friend to be gone all night. Sean had to call to wake her up and tell her to come home, saying, quote, "You need to come home and get your kid. I'm going to be late to work otherwise." End quote. Scott dropped Amber off at her car in the Elephant Bar parking lot, where it had collected a parking citation overnight. She took the ticket off the windshield and brought it back to his truck, telling him to keep it as a memento, implying that they probably wouldn't see each other again. He took the ticket, but told her he definitely wanted to see her again and asked if she felt the same way. She said she wanted to see him again too, but she felt ashamed for spending the night with him on their first date. She told him it felt like a one-night stand. He assured her that it wasn't and said even though they'd just met, he felt like they'd really connected. He wanted to get to know her better and said he would keep in touch as much as he could while traveling for the holidays over the next 5 weeks. He'd also given her a very open time frame concerning when exactly he'd be able to see her again, narrowing it down to sometime between right that minute and before the end of January. But there must have been something about his promise to call and claims of a true connection that she didn't fully trust, because although he'd told her they'd see each other again, when Amber kissed him goodbye that morning she didn't look back, almost certain that they never would. She was surprised when he called that afternoon, already wanting to see her again after passing through Fresno on his way back from a meeting, but Amber was tired, probably hungover and had clients booked for the rest of the day, so she passed on the visit. He left her a voicemail the next day, saying he regretted not seeing her before going on his trip to Alaska for Thanksgiving, which he actually spent in San Diego with his wife, at his parents' house. This was the same time frame of their family trip to Disneyland, and Amber didn't hear from Scott again until the 2nd of December, the day after Laci made her final entry into her pregnancy diary. Although it's also in part 6 of the series, it's a short entry, so let's read it again. December 1st, 2002. On our trip down to San Diego for Thanksgiving, Scott and I came up with another name for the baby, Logan. We'll have to start using the name and speaking to the baby to see if we like the sound of it. Connor is still on our minds, but we're not certain. If we do go with Connor, we need to decide on how we're going to spell it, with ER or OR. On the 2nd of December, Scott called Amber with no warning, saying he wasn't far from her house and wanted to take her hiking. He arrived at her door a while later, with 2 bags of groceries and a bouquet of amaryllis. They picked up Ayanna from preschool together, and the 3 of them hiked to a place called Squaw's Leap, stopping for a picnic along the trail. He brought snacks and a blanket and couldn't stop grinning as he watched Ayanna and Amber, saying, quote, "Look at me, I've got a rigor mortis smile." End quote. Scott carried Ayanna back down the trail and she fell asleep in his truck after they stargazed for a little while. He and Amber talked a bit about Thanksgiving and family, but something he said left her with the impression that he wasn't best pleased with one of his family members. Saying, quote, "Some relatives you don't really like, but you have to get along with, because they're family," end quote. But Amber didn't want to pry, so she didn't ask for details and told him that anyone with a family could understand. Then she asked about his trip to Alaska, and he pulled out a picture of himself smiling and holding a fish, telling her it had gone great. Scott brought all the ingredients to make seafood lasagna, so they headed back to Amber's place, but before he started cooking he asked if it was alright to give Ayanna a gift. She thanked him for asking her first, and when he handed over the beautifully illustrated pop-up book he'd wrapped up for her daughter, she decided that Scott was perfect. He was considerate, generous, successful, cultured and romantic. Amber thought she'd struck gold, even more so as she realized how comfortable she was around him. She said it felt like she'd known him for years, and she got the feeling he felt the same way about her, and they spent another night together. And she must have really meant it when she said she was comfortable with him, because when he came back to town again the next day, she decided to ask him to pick Ayanna up from preschool. Even though her mom was already planning to get her, Amber called her off, took the key for her apartment and Ayanna's car seat to the school office, and let them know that Scott Peterson would be picking her daughter up that afternoon. He had to show his ID to the staff before he took her, but the toddler was happy to head back to Amber's guest house with him. He started dinner while they waited for her to get home. She arrived soon after to find Ayanna happily eating in her high chair. Later that evening, they picked out a Christmas tree together. Traditionally a family activity, some of the staff assumed they were Ayanna's parents. Amber and Scott didn't feel the need to correct them, and by that night, she was already picturing their future together. As they set up the Christmas tree, she told him the story behind each ornament that had special meaning for her as she hung it up, all the while envisioning him as a husband to her and a father to Ayanna. The tree wasn't finished before she began asking if he'd ever been married or thought about proposing to a woman before. Of course, he told her he'd never been married or anything close to it, and when he said he'd better get going so he could find a hotel for the night, she told him to stay. They lied together again, but after, they talked about trust and honesty. He told her he admired the value she put on the truth, saying, "That's an unusual quality, you're an amazing woman." Going through the pregnancy and birth of her daughter alone made Amber stronger, and her independence was the driving force behind the successful fresh start she'd made with Ayanna. It was a trait she was proud of, and after the string of heartbreak and drama that had her so tangled up after Josh and Anthony, she was happy to be on her own, but now that the dust settled and she was back on her feet, she realized how lonely she'd become. She would often cozy Ayanna up in her stroller for long walks, feeling something was missing as she passed by the smiling couples and young families in her neighborhood. By the end of the summer of 2002, she'd begun to pray for a good man to share her life with. And when her protective best friend Sean matched her with Scott a few months later, she thought he was God's answer to her prayers. He was successful, owning multiple properties stocked with boats and Land Rovers, and he was running the regional branch of Trade Corps' sales division in California. He was well educated and well traveled. He was considerate, funny, handsome, and charming. But most importantly, he not only had amazing chemistry with both her and Ayanna, he was looking for a lifelong mate and a committed relationship, just like she was. The next day, which was the 4th of December, he helped her set up the workspace she just leased at American Body Works, earning himself a massage for his efforts. Amber said she kept things strictly professional and never intended for him to pay, but he insisted, and on their way to lunch after he withdrew a large amount of money from the ATM, he peeled enough off of the stack for Amber to cover the massage, as well as a generous tip. They had lunch at the Whole Foods deli, where Amber told him a story about apples while they ate. When she was pregnant with Ayanna, she also had braces on her teeth and couldn't eat caramel apples, which were one of her favorite sweets. She was super excited to get one after the braces came off, but she'd been disappointed when she bit into it, because it wasn't a pink lady. Scott listened intently to her story about the apples, and they parted ways after lunch on the 4th, but not before making plans to get together again. Amber actually wanted him to attend an art show with her the next evening, but Scott told her he had to go to San Francisco and couldn't make it. She didn't see him again until December 9th, but several things had transpired during the brief time they'd spent apart, and Scott was distraught when he showed up on her doorstep that day. As soon as he stepped inside, he said he wasn't doing well and needed to talk to her urgently. He was saying something about destroying the beautiful relationship they had, and Amber could tell he was very distressed. She was asking what was wrong, but he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he took her hand, walked her into the living room, moved her chairs so they could face each other, and sat her down. He was still silent but on the verge of tears now, and Amber began to anxiously ask him what was wrong and what was going on. He told her it'd be so much easier if she just hated him, if she hated him so much she never wanted to see him again. He said he would understand if she hated him and that he hated himself for lying to her. He was openly crying now, having trouble swallowing and catching his breath. Tears streamed down his face as he held onto her hands and said, "I lied to you about being married." Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and support the channel if you fancy the series. We'll pick up next time with Amber's reaction to Scott's tearful confession, and we'll head back to Modesto to learn how Laci's family handled the news about his affair. You won't want to miss it, so see you next time, and as always, stay safe, be kind, and memento mori.